Baruch Spinoza exposed the forbidden gospel that reveals who truly murdered Jesus. And what if everything you were ever taught about sin was in fact an intricate lie, meticulously designed for the sole purpose of control? What if the very concept of a chosen people, a divine mandate for power and privilege, originated not in the heavens, but from the cunning pens of men desperate to justify their earthly dominion? For centuries, millions have lived paralyzed by the crippling idea of offending an invisible creator. Their lives spent trembling before the possibility of endless torment merely for private thoughts they could not master. But there was one man who refused to inherit this terror. He dared to stare into the abyss of spiritual dread, determined to dismantle the entire machinery of religious fear, using the sharpest, most perilous tools available: unyielding logic and absolute reason. His name was Baruch Spinoza. What he uncovered would not only shake the foundations of established religion, but reveal the all-too-human political origin of what the world calls divine word. Our journey begins in the tense, shadowed air of Amsterdam, 1656. The setting is a hushed council room where a young man barely 23 stands accused of the gravest crime imaginable, the simple act of asking questions. The air inside the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam hung heavy and thick, charged with the brittle tension of whispered accusations. In the year 1656, a young Baruch Spinoza, only 23 years old, faced the council of elders. His summoning was not for having committed any visible crime, no theft, no violence, but for something far more subversive and fundamentally dangerous. He had applied his rigorous mind to the sacred texts. He had asked the questions no one was permitted to utter aloud. Questions about the undeniable contradictions within the Holy Scriptures. Questions challenging the mythical authorship of the books attributed to Moses. Most dangerously, he dared to question whether the figure of a creator who meticulously rewards and punishes human behavior was anything more than a psychological projection of humanity's own deepest, most primitive fears. The elders watched him with a volatile mixture of contempt and undisguised dread. They recognized instantly that this youth was not some fleeting skeptic easily dismissed. He was a methodical scholar, a thinker who had scrutinized every single line of the Torah with the same ruthless precision that a mathematician brings to bear upon an equation. His critique was not born of ignorance. It was forged in profound, unsettling knowledge. Sensing the monumental threat he posed to their established order, they offered a solution that others would have seized without hesitation: a generous sum of money, an annual pension, if he would simply agree to silence his explosive conclusions, to continue attending the synagogue as a seemingly compliant member. It was an exchange of discretion for economic security, the golden cage. But Spinoza looked into the eyes of those powerful men and saw the true currency. They demanded the betrayal of truth itself. The sale of his sacred capacity to reason for the hollow comfort of belonging. His response was a resolute silence, a moment that spoke louder than any defense he could have mounted. Then, as if something ancient and deeply malevolent awakened in the room, one of the elders began to read the text of the Harem, the most devastating curse in Judaism, signifying total and absolute excommunication. The words fell upon Spinoza like stones, condemning him utterly. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. The final deafening blast of the shofar echoed through the sanctuary, an ancestral shriek announcing his definitive expulsion from his people, his family, his heritage. Spinoza was utterly alone, yet in his eyes there was no trace of regret. There was only clarity, a dangerous, exhilarating clarity. He had lost his community, But in that moment of profound abandonment, he became truly free, recognizing that the fear of divine retribution was the chain not of God, but of man. He had traded a borrowed certainty for the truth of his own mind, and that was a victory greater than any material wealth. Having cast himself out from the comfort of community, Spinoza began his monumental undertaking, what he chillingly termed the surgery of the spirit. He approached the sacred texts not with reverence, but with the cold surgical detachment of an anatomist examining a corpse. His necessity was not rooted in malice, but in a profound intellectual hunger. He needed to understand how documents demonstrably written by men in specific historical epochs and infused with clear political intentions had been elevated to the status of the eternal, unquestionable voice of the Supreme Being. He started with the bedrock of both Jewish and Christian faith. The Pentateuch, the 5 books traditionally attributed to Moses, supposedly written under direct divine inspiration. Spinoza's precise examination yielded something utterly shattering to the legend. He noted with chilling logic that the text consistently referred to Moses in the third person. It described in vivid detail Moses' death and his burial. It mentioned locations that would not receive their named identity until centuries after Moses was believed to have lived. Most damningly, it employed phrases such as, "until this day," an expression that only makes coherent sense, coming from a historian writing long after the events transpired. The conclusion became terrifyingly inevitable. For those who cherished certainty, these texts were not the work of Moses, nor even the product of a single lifetime. They were compilations, edits, and continuous rewritings carried out over generations by scribes, each possessing an unmistakable, very human agenda. And one of those agendas loomed clearest of all: the absolute necessity to establish a specific human group as uniquely favored, chosen above all others on earth. Spinoza recorded this in his private hidden notes. The idea of the chosen people is not a divine revelation. It is a political instrument. It serves to justify terrestrial privileges, to sanctify the relentless claiming of land, and most crucially, to draw an impenetrable line between us and them, all sealed with the apparent authority of the heavens. But Spinoza pressed the point, his reason piercing the dogma. If the divine is truly infinite, an absolute encompassing all reality, how could it possibly choose one fragment over the magnificent totality? The very act of choosing contradicts the boundless universal nature of the sacred. This insight, if fully published in his lifetime, would have warranted not merely excommunication, but execution, because Spinoza was not attacking a peripheral belief. He was surgically dismantling the central pillar of identity for 2 entire world religions. Yet he would not stop there. He would soon delve into the moral fabric of these scriptures, discovering something far more unsettling than mere political editing. Spinoza refused to rest on the political revelations of authorship. He plunged deeper, examining the very moral core of the narratives that had been taught for millennia as the ultimate examples of faith, obedience, and virtue. What he uncovered beneath the patina of sanctity was profoundly disturbing: the insidious normalization of acts that under any other context would be instantly condemned as atrocities. Consider the story of Abraham and Isaac. For generations, this has been enshrined as the supreme test of faith. A father willing to murder his own son because a voice believed to be God's commanded it. The narrative offers salvation at the last moment, rewarding blind, unquestioning obedience. Spinoza's pen cut through the theological gloss. What kind of morality teaches that obeying an order to assassinate your own child is virtuous? And what kind of celestial parent tests love by demanding the unimaginable? He reasoned that if a man hears voices today demanding the murder of his child, we call him severely disturbed. But when that same voice is attributed to the divine, The private madness is immediately converted into public sanctity. This story, Spinoza concluded, does not teach faith. It teaches that obedience must stand above compassion, above reason, and even above the most fundamental human love. The examination continued with a harrowing narrative of the Great Flood. A creator repenting of his own handiwork decides to drown all of humanity, including innocent children, the elderly and blameless animals, saving only one small family. The traditionalists called this divine justice. Spinoza saw something else entirely, a cosmic failure. If an infinitely wise being creates something imperfect, the flaw lies either in the creation or in the creator. And if that being resorts to destroying what he made, it demonstrates not ultimate power, but ultimate failure. This account, Spinoza asserted, is not a portrait of a supreme transcendent being. It is a description of a capricious tyrant imbued with human emotions, human errors, and human cruelty. It is the vast, chilling projection of ancient kings who punished entire kingdoms for the actions of a few, a terrifying justification for power elevated to the level of the cosmos. Spinoza further exposed the ethical rot in the story of Lot, the righteous man, who offered his own daughters to a mob for sexual violence simply to protect two male visitors. The narrative presents this as a supreme act of hospitality. Spinoza saw the brutal reality, a value system where male ownership over women was so absolute that they could be sacrificed without the text expressing the slightest moral condemnation. Then there was the conquest of Canaan, where the explicit order was the total indiscriminate elimination of entire populations without regard for age or gender, cloaked in the language of a divine mandate, a holy war. Spinoza wrote, "If these actions were committed today by any army on earth, we would universally condemn them as crimes against humanity. Yet when they are cloaked in the sacred, they suddenly become acceptable, even admirable." The text does not describe divine morality. It describes the ruthless morality of conquerors who desperately needed to justify the unjustifiable. Each of Spinoza's findings was a devastating fissure in the colossal edifice of institutional faith. He knew he was not just challenging beliefs. He was exposing a system meticulously engineered over centuries for tangible purposes: social control, the legitimation of violence, and the rigid maintenance of hierarchies of power. But the most dangerous discovery, the core revelation about tyranny and betrayal, still lay ahead, waiting in the forbidden territory of the Christian Gospels. Having mapped the intellectual deceit woven into the foundation of the Old Testament, Spinoza did not stop at the recognized frontier. He crossed into the hostile territory of the New Testament, into the very heart of the Christian narrative, searching for patterns of contradiction and conspiracy surrounding the figure of Jesus. Through a network of secret contacts, fragments obtained from disillusioned monks, letters exchanged in veiled code, Spinoza began the perilous task of reconstructing a history that the official authorities had attempted to erase entirely. This forgotten history centered on a single notorious text, a gospel that the Church decreed must never exist, the Gospel of Judas. For nearly 2 millennia, Judas Iscariot had served as the ultimate universal symbol of human perfidy, the man who sold his spiritual master for a paltry 30 pieces of silver. His name was synonymous with betrayal, his image painted on church walls as an eternal visceral warning. Yet as Spinoza compared the 4 canonical Gospels, those selected by political councils centuries after the events, he found a gaping inconsistency that theological dogma had never satisfactorily resolved. The details of the betrayal shifted. In some versions, Judas was a simple greedy thief. In others, a man possessed by literal demons. In still others, merely a necessary instrument, fulfilling an essential prophecy. If his action was in fact required for the salvation of humanity, How could Judas be held completely culpable? It was a theological paradox, a cognitive dissonance left vibrating at the core of the faith. But in the fragile fragments of the forbidden gospel, Spinoza discovered a counter-narrative so profound, it inverted the entire story of salvation. Here Judas did not betray Jesus. Instead, he obeyed his master's most difficult, most sacrificial instruction. According to this lost account, Jesus knew his spiritual movement was infiltrated, recognized that the temple authorities and Rome were closing their iron net. He understood that if he were arrested while surrounded by his disciples, the entire group, the entirety of his teaching legacy, would be summarily executed. The only path to safeguard the remaining group was for one of them, one utterly bound by absolute loyalty and unwavering trust, to stage a meticulous false betrayal. Judas accepted this impossible burden not for 30 pieces of silver, but as an act of singular devotion. The lost text describes him bearing this impossible weight. What they will say of me will be a lie. But I carry that lie so that the truth of my master may live. Spinoza must have trembled as he read those lines, realizing that if this reconstruction was true, the vast edifice of institutional Christianity rested upon a deliberate, calculated inversion of reality. A strategic narrative lie designed to facilitate a deeper political transformation. The truth exposed by Spinoza's fragments pointed toward a monumental shift, an act of strategic narrative engineering. The core reason Jesus died, Spinoza argued, was devastatingly simple and entirely political. The original message that ignited his movement was not a soft whisper of redemption after death. It was a loud, uncompromising demand for justice now. He was killed because he was systematically exposing the institutional corruption of the temple, revealing how the religious leaders had transformed faith into a lucrative business and the sacred temple into nothing more than a bank. When Jesus famously overturned the tables of the money changers, it was not a symbolic metaphor. It was a direct revolutionary assault on a corrupt economic system. Therefore, he was killed not for blasphemy, but for revealing the truth, for posing a direct terrestrial threat to the Sanhedrin's wealth and Rome's fragile stability. Following his execution, his followers faced an existential crisis. The movement was shattered, pursued, and on the brink of complete eradication. It was at this crucial juncture Spinoza hypothesized that certain political leaders saw an opportunity. They could not destroy the powerful symbol of Jesus, but they could reroute and transform it from a dangerous political threat demanding immediate justice into a harmless, spiritually focused tool demanding only obedience and patience. The original cry for terrestrial resistance had to be silenced, replaced by the calming promise of celestial reward. For this transformation to succeed, they required a flawless villain, a definitive source of human evil to carry the full, unbearable weight of guilt. Judas, already dead and unable to defend his selfless act, became the perfect, absolute scapegoat. Spinoza concluded that the betrayal of Judas was not a mere historical event. It was a narrative necessity. The leaders needed to convert a profound political act of courageous resistance into an emotionally potent, spiritual drama of redemption. The revolution became the religion. The sharp, challenging denunciations of corruption were softened into doctrines of submission, and the impassioned plea for justice on earth was successfully smothered by the lure of compensation in heaven. This transition was finalized decades later, when the great church councils, most notably Nicaea, convened not as gatherings of saints seeking divine truth, but as political assemblies that decreed which texts served the new power structure and which must be declared heretical. Hundreds of alternative gospels were commanded to be burned, their existence erased. Only 4 survived, those that told the correct story. The story that elevated suffering into virtue, poverty into purity, and above all else, obedience into sanctity. With terrifying clarity, Spinoza saw the immutable pattern woven into the fabric of power. Institutionalized religion does not exist to liberate the human spirit. It exists to control it. And its most sophisticated instrument is not love or inspiration, but the calculated, persistent deployment of fear. The fear of sin, the fear of eternal punishment, the crippling fear of being cast out, cursed, and utterly condemned. This fear is a virus painstakingly injected into the soul from infancy, reinforced through every ritual and breathed into every sacred text. Once this invisible judge is installed within the human psyche, the person requires no visible shackles. They become their own vigilant warden, practicing self-censorship, ruthlessly repressing their doubts and punishing their most natural desires, all because they have internalized a divine surveillance system. And this invisible judge Spinoza, observed conveniently, always agrees with the earthly authorities who claim to interpret its will. Spinoza named this condition spiritual slavery, and he deemed it infinitely more dangerous than any physical bondage. For the slave who remains unaware of his captivity does not seek freedom. Worse, he actively defends his chains, calling them sacred, and attacking anyone like Spinoza himself who dares to suggest they be broken. This truly was Spinoza's ultimate crime in the eyes of his age. He did not deny the existence of the divine absolute. He attacked the manipulation of the divine. He did not negate the possibility of spirituality. He vehemently denied that human intermediaries held exclusive access to it. For any religious institution, this assertion is the supreme heresy. If every individual can access truth directly through their own faculty of reason, if they require no priests, no elaborate temples, and no exclusive texts to understand reality, then the entire multi-layered edifice of power collapses into dust. The years that followed his excommunication were marked by quiet hardship. Spinoza lived in relative anonymity, meticulously polishing optical lenses to survive a symbolic livelihood, bringing clarity to a world shrouded in fog. He wrote his earth-shattering ideas in treatises that circulated only in secret among a small, discreet circle of European thinkers. He understood that open publication meant certain persecution, not just from the synagogue, but from the Christian church, which saw in his reasoned challenges an even greater, more systemic threat. He famously refused a prestigious professorship at the University of Heidelberg, knowing that the golden cage of academia would necessitate constant surveillance and the censorship of his words. He chose the uncomfortable freedom of poverty over the suffocating certainty of controlled authority. As winter mist blanketed Amsterdam in 1677, Spinoza felt the final chilling approach of time. Tuberculosis, exacerbated by years of inhaling fine glass dust from his solitary work, finally claimed him. He was only 44. On his deathbed, surrounded by only a few loyal friends, there was no sign of remorse, no frantic plea for forgiveness, no attempt at reconciliation with any established faith. He simply closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that he had achieved the one thing that truly mattered: to think freely. Yet before his passing, Spinoza had taken careful, calculated precautions. His most dangerous manuscripts, those containing his most devastating philosophical analysis of religion, the lost Gospels, and the entire political construction of the sacred, were carefully divided. Copies were sent to different cities, hidden in private libraries, and entrusted to a silent, scattered network of thinkers who shared his vision. He knew the authorities would come to confiscate and burn every scrap of paper bearing his name, and indeed, they did. Hours after his last breath, agents scoured his meager room, seizing papers and interrogating neighbors, but it was already too late. The seeds were planted. For decades, Spinoza's name remained synonymous with atheism, moral danger, and forbidden thought. His books were banned across Europe. To even mention his ideas in public was to risk total ostracism. Yet beneath the surface, his influence grew like a powerful underground river. Voltaire read him in secret. Diderot utilized his foundational principle that knowledge must be built on evidence, not authority, to construct his great encyclopedia. The entire Enlightenment drank from Spinoza's well without publicly acknowledging the source, for the risk remained too great. The current of thought was invisible, but it was relentless, slowly eroding the very foundations of absolute religious power. Then, centuries later, in 1945, near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a peasant stumbled upon an earthenware jar. Inside were ancient texts, gospels that the church had decreed were destroyed, lost and non-existent. Among them were fragments that confirmed Spinoza's audacious intuition. The official history of Jesus, of Judas, and of the origins of Christianity had been meticulously edited, censored, and rewritten to serve specific political ends. The discovery caused an academic shockwave, but the machinery of control had evolved. It no longer burned books in the public square. It simply contained them in museums, labeling them non-canonical curiosities, stripping them of their danger by turning them into dead relics. Spinoza had predicted this modern mechanism in one of his final writings. When the truth cannot be burned, it will be merely dismissed. Yet the seed he planted did not die with him, nor with the censorship of his words. It germinated in every single mind that has since dared to ask, what if the fear I feel comes not from heaven, but from those who claim to speak in its name? Spinoza's final revelation was not that nothing is sacred. It was that the most sacred thing that exists is your own capacity to think, to question, and to refuse to accept as absolute truth anything that fails the relentless scrutiny of reason. That capacity is what makes you human. And it is precisely what every system of tyranny across every age has desperately tried to steal from you. The forbidden gospel, the excommunicated philosopher, the centuries of censorship, it all leads to this moment. You now stand with the information before you, facing the same ultimate decision Spinoza faced in that tense synagogue. Do you accept the comfortable silence in exchange for belonging? Or do you choose the uncomfortable clarity that comes from thinking for yourself? The door Spinoza opened in Amsterdam remains open today. Freedom is not a gift that is granted. It is an act that is chosen. And that act begins not with noisy rebellion, but with one silent, solitary question. Why do I believe what I believe?